Good morning. My name is Steve Maher. I'm with Risk Management Professionals, and welcome to our continuing series on process safety management and risk management program best practices. Most of you know we're a PSM and RMP consulting firm, and we provide services to a variety of industries, and we use these opportunities to share best practices and provide some guidance in terms of how to deal with the regulatory environment, and that'll be a key focus for today. We're going to focus on changes to the regulatory environment and some of the new regulations that are coming up that apply to California facilities and also throughout the United States. The key speakers will be myself, Steve Maher, and also Jordan Schultz on our staff. Jordan and I and several others on staff have been closely following a lot of the regulatory developments and changes in the environment over the past couple of years, and we wanted to use this opportunity to share that with you. This also is an opportunity for us. We put a paper together, and we'll be providing a URL so you can get a copy of the paper if you want, and presenting it at the Global Congress on Process Safety. That'll be in Austin, Texas in late April. If you guys are attending, please feel free to stop by. We're going to use this opportunity today to do a little dry run. So we're going to be watching our time, so we'll be moving fairly quickly, and we'll be going over some of the topics fairly quickly too. So the paper, if you wish to download it, will provide more complete reference and additional details in some of the areas that you might be interested in. So, Katie, start the clock. All right. So let's talk about our key topics. I'll start with a little bit of background on safety management system programs, current environment and overlap. We'll be pushing that towards an overview of the expansion and modernization programs that are currently in place. Jordan will be talking about some of the key elements of those, how they're going to be rolled out, and I'll come back and talk about impact on your programs and some tips on how do you manage the changes that are occurring and some of the new program elements. And then, as I mentioned before, we'll open it up for questions. So let's talk about the current programs. Most of you probably recognize some of the photographs here from Bhopal, from Deepwater Horizon. These tragedies have prompted a change, an evolutionary change in the safety management system regulatory environment. By safety management system, of course, we're talking about programs such as process safety management, risk management programs, and safety and environmental management systems. SEMS applies offshore, PSM and RMP apply onshore. And if you look at the evolution of these programs, you see a parallel evolution. And even though there's a difference in time, a difference in location, this parallel evolution has really brought us to a fairly unified set of elements that help us manage safety at these facilities. When you look at the elements that are currently in process safety management, you'll see a lot of the familiar process safety information, process hazards analysis, operating procedures, management of change and mechanical integrity that are designed to work together to provide a system to manage safety at the plant site. When you look at these different programs, you pretty much have significant overlap for a lot of the key programs that are implemented on the national level and most of the state accidental release prevention programs too. The green area shows the elements we just discussed that are common to everything. On the far right, hazard assessment is an element that's necessary for risk management programs and the state accidental release prevention programs that are, of course, focused more on community protection. So this is the current environment. You've got parallel evolution and significant overlap for a common set of elements that have been shown to help you manage safety at the plant site. So what's happening right now? There have been a couple of accidents earlier in this decade. The tragedy at West in Texas and the tragedies associated with several accidents at onshore facilities have really brought us to the point of taking a fresh look at safety management systems. If you look at the agencies involved, you'll see the Chemical Safety Board, Interagency Refinery Task Force in California, Contra Costa County in the city of Richmond, California OSHA, Federal EPA, and also the California Office of Emergency Services are all taking a fresh look at these safety management system programs. What's been happening over the past couple of years is several drafts that have come out and also some requirements that are already on the books that we'll be talking about shortly that deal with this evolution. If you look at the federal level on the top arrow, the Fed OSHA and Fed EPA have come out with requests for information for some of their proposed new elements to get feedback from industry and the regulatory community. If you look at the federal level also, Chemical Safety Board has put out 3 major reports following the Richmond refinery fire on August 6, 2012. And these reports have come up with several recommendations for a number of agencies to implement to move their programs forward. The White House has also issued Executive Order 13650 that was designed to also promote the agencies working together. If you look at the bottom arrow with California agencies, Cal OSHA, Contra Costa County, City of Richmond, all those have been putting forth either drafts or industrial safety ordinances to promote or propose or implement new program elements. And we'll be going over the specifics of those elements right now. So what I'd like to do is invite Jordan Schultz over, and he'll go through some of the key elements for some of the major programs that are either will directly affect you in the near term or are likely to affect you in the long term. Jordan?
And as Steve just mentioned, I'm Jordan Schultz. I'm also with Risk Management, and I'm just going to go briefly and pretty quickly through some of the proposed changes and changes that have already been enacted. So the key elements of these regulatory expansion and modernization efforts are following impact categories. We broke these up just to make it a little bit more digestible. There's a potential for altering program facility types or add facilities to regulatory programs. We put that as number 1. This has obviously pretty big ramifications for some specific industries. Potentials for significant effort or change. For the second type, this also obviously would have significant change. Items that require minimal effort. These are pretty minor, but definitely still keep an eye on them as they can sneak up on you. And number 4 is pretty negligible effort beyond what you're already doing. So as you can see, we've got the table broken up. The first 3 are that first category, which is, like I said, altering or bringing new facilities into the regulatory regime, changing and closing out the atmospheric storage tank exemption, and then the next 2, oil and gas well drilling and servicing, as well as production facilities. These essentially were meant to always be covered under PSM, is what OSHA has stated. What happened was they had proposed a separate set of rules for them, and it never quite got finished, and the economic analysis never occurred. So they're wanting to finish that economic analysis so they can start regulating production facilities and possibly drilling and gas servicing. Handling coverage and requirements for activity hazards. This is a new one as well. What they're trying to do is something sort of like the New Jersey Toxic Catastrophe Prevention Act. So if you're curious about that one, take a look there. There's some pretty good material there. Updating the list of applicable chemicals and threshold quantities. This one is pretty negligible. They haven't really given us much information, so there's not too much to be said there yet. Requiring additional management system elements. They both borrowed from Center for Chemical Process Safety's RBPS, or Risk-Based Process Safety, and SE or SIMS revisions. So the first set, measurements and metrics. This is something that's also been looked at by the ISOs that Steve had mentioned. Basically looking at some of your process safety information and how you're doing on MOCs, training, things like that. Assigning numbers and making sure you're tracking it to show that your program is going in the right direction. Also, you have management review and continuous improvement and process safety competency. Basically, management review, trying to look into things between just your triennial compliance audits. Process safety competency being making sure you have a breadth of information that's readily available to employees. SEMS revisions, the stop work authority. Anyone that thinks that things are unsafe should be able to stop the work. You have an ultimate work authority that's going to go ahead and make sure that we cut things off, and there's somebody that can say, yeah, we need to stop work. And augmenting the employee participation plan to make sure employees are more involved. The second table, evaluation of updates and adding additional definition for RAGAGEP. This one's pretty simple. Basically, they've never really fully said what recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices are, and they want to define that to help facilities comply to it. Covering the mechanical integrity of any safety critical equipment. This is also covered by the ISO. It's essentially something you should already be doing. They're just making sure to close out some of the things, as they used to have a comprehensive list. They want to make sure you're doing anything safety critical. The management of organizational changes. This is pretty different. It's been linked to several incidents, including Texas City, where facilities didn't quite look at the changes in staffing like you would changes in any equipment or the process itself. Requiring coordination of emergency planning with local emergency response authorities. This one's pretty self-explanatory. Basically making sure that you're talking with your LEPC and who's going to be responding to emergencies to make sure that things like West Texas, where incident responders come in and they don't know exactly what's happening. Requiring third-party compliance audits. They want to see if basically that level of independence will go ahead and lead to better results with compliance auditing. Expanding the requirements of 1910, 109, 106, and 107. These are pretty niche, and realistically they're pretty minor as well. It's basically updating the latest NFPA standards. And regulations addressing the storage, handling, and management of ammonium nitrate. This obviously is in response to West Texas as well. It's kind of vague on exactly what to do with ammonium nitrate, and they want to make sure that standards are handed down to make sure these can be regulated and handled safely. Enforcement of the PSM RMP exemption for retail facilities. This one's pretty large. A lot of ammonium facilities, they're going ahead and taking the retail facility exemption. This wasn't exactly OSHA's position. However, they want to make sure that they make it much more clear on what they do consider to be a retail facility. Enforcement of policy for highly hazardous chemicals without specific concentration thresholds. OSHA is looking to basically move towards what EPA does, and that is if it's over 1%, if that weight of the regulated chemical is above the threshold, then it's covered by the standard. Safer technology and alternative analysis. This is also in the Richmond and Contra Costa County ISO. This essentially is going ahead and trying to apply LOPA and other things like that to make sure that things are as safe as possible, and you've looked at alternatives to make sure that if you can reduce the hazard, you have. Hierarchy of hazard control analysis. This is fairly similar. What you're doing is making sure that not only you have the appropriate safeguards, but you have the best safeguards and they're all functioning as they should to make it as low as, the risk as low as reasonably practicable. Emergency response drills. Automated detection and monitoring, and additional stationary source requirements. These are all fairly minor, but they do require some thought. One of the stationary source requirements they have mentioned would be basically making a buffer zone between the facility and the public. Incident investigation and accident history requirements. This is fairly major. One thing that they're starting to look for is maybe going towards root cause analysis, which is quite a bit more intensive than some incident investigation procedures are currently. Making sure that quantity requirements involving your worst case scenario for numerous small vessels. There have been incidents where, say, propane storage facilities have had incidents and basically your one small container ruptures 10, 20, 100 others and then makes much more large release than was reasonably predicted. Public disclosure of information to promote compliance and public understanding. This is pretty simple, basically starting to release more and more information on the facility and its covered process. It doesn't include your HAZOP, your hazard assessment, things like that, but just making sure the public is involved to help monitor the facility. Changes the threshold quantities and endpoints for OCAs. This is similar to the threshold quantity changes. It's pretty simple. Program 3 NAICS code changes due to RMP accident history data. You have 10 codes that automatically qualify for Program 3 if they're unavailable to hit Program 1. They've changed 5 of them from some of the chemical processing, and they've realized it's more on refrigeration and wastewater treatment often have more incidents, and they're seeing if that should automatically go to Program 3. The safety case regulatory model. This is pretty significant. It's proposed by the EPA. Essentially, you're proving to the regulator why you're safe to operate rather than the current regulatory regime, which is a little bit more like we're doing these things and thus it's safe instead of proving why this is safe. Streamlining RMP requirements and effects on OSHA PSM applicability. This is similar kind of vein. PHA recommendation closure timeline. This has been put through by Cal OSHA and Cal ARP. Basically, instead of having a timely closure, now they're saying 2 years, 3 years. In California currently it's 2.5 and 1.5 on incident investigation. Damage mechanism review. This has been proposed due to Chevron Richmond and several other incidents that have occurred due to corrosion. Safeguard protection analysis. This is also in the Cal OSHA standard as well as the ISOs. Essentially, they propose to use LOPA or some sort of similar methodology to go ahead and prove that, yes, we have the safeguards and they are effective. Contractor research and documentation. Instead of just getting your contractor due to their ability to do the work, making sure that they can do the work safely and then making requirements on incidents. And management of change, interacting with other PSM elements. As Cal OSHA states it, you have the DMR, HCA, SPA, and several other elements. You're making sure that those are accounted for in management of change rather than just doing a simple PHA. Incident investigation, there are specific requirements for RCA. We kind of discussed this earlier, and also what we just discussed with the DMR, PHA, HCA, and SPA on recommended actions. And 3 items that are fairly interrelated, they're also as part of the ISOs. Process safety culture assessment, basically making sure that the reward systems at facilities don't impede safety goals, and it's not putting production over safety. Human factors program, making sure that you're looking at things and then things that can affect the personnel, such as heat, controls, logic, et cetera, to make sure that it's not just safe from a process side, but safe from a human side. And then a PSM management system is also wanting to be put in place, where there is a central head and you have the organizational chart that is going to be easily read and everyone knows exactly what their responsibilities are. And with that, I'm going to kick back to Steve, and he's going to go ahead and talk about potential impacts for these regulations.
The mic on? All right, good. Jordan, thank you. All right, so what I want to do is take a look at where we're going with this. You know what's out there, what's been proposed. Let's take a look in our crystal balls a little bit and see what's likely to come up. As I mentioned before, you saw this slide before, there's a number of agencies looking into modernizing or expanding the current regulatory environment for safety management systems. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a yellow bar with a URL. We're trying to monitor this as closely as possible. Obviously, it's a moving target, but we do keep a web page that's trying to keep up with all these changes, all the proposed guidelines. I hope you find it useful. It's got some convenient locations to download the proposed regulations, the ones that are on the books. And what we've also done is, since we've done a number of webinars to identify details on how to approach damage mechanism reviews, a lot of the other current PSM elements, and also taking a look at the regulatory environment changes. There's a lot of resources there and links to previous webinars and recordings. You're welcome to download them, use them, take a look, and we hope they're helpful. So what's coming up? Chemical Safety Board's done. They complete their incident investigation, but they're tracking recommendations that were made to industry and also agencies. California Interagency Refinery Task Force, they're continuing to meet, but they're not expecting to publish anything else. The outlet from that group and their energies are being directed towards changes in industrial safety ordinances, CalARP, and also the Cal OSHA requirements that deal with highly hazardous facilities. US EPA and federal OSHA have put out requests for information. They're currently digesting the comments that were provided to them, and over a period of next few years, they're likely to update the draft. They're likely to issue a draft regulatory update, PSM and RMP, and then implement it. Cal OSHA has updated their process safety management requirements. They put out a draft regulation, proposed regulation, on October 31st. They're expecting to promulgate it in the first part of 2016. Initially, there's going to be 2 separate PSM regulations in California, one that applies to refineries essentially, and one applies to everyone else. It's not expected to be synchronized with the federal PSM and RMP requirements that exist currently or are being proposed. Contra Costa County and the City of Richmond, they have issued their industrial safety ordinances that apply to specific companies and facilities in their jurisdictions. CalARP, the California Accidental Release Prevention Program. On January 1st, there was a minor update. Currently, they're anticipating to move forward and align it with the upgrades to the Cal-OSHA PSM requirements that are being proposed. Likely not be promulgated or implemented as law until after Cal-OSHA implements 5189. And they're only planning to have one regulation that applies to a number of different facilities, all highly hazardous facilities, with a separate category that's being proposed for the ones that they consider the most hazardous. So initially they're not going to be synchronized with the Cal-OSHA requirements, but they're likely to align with some of the elements that they deem appropriate. So that's what to expect when you look at it from a big picture perspective. The bubbles on the left is the current environment. You're likely to see a number of overlapping but different requirements in the near term with a lot of new elements, many of which Jordan discussed. And in the bottom right-hand corner, the environment in the medium term is going to be a number of different regulations that aren't synchronized, that have different elements, but again, a lot of overlap. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how do you deal with that. Now the good news is that in the long term, we had a situation like this in the 1980s, where you had risk management and prevention programs in California that were promulgated. Once the 92 hit and OSHA PSM came out, you had some overlapping but very different requirements between the RMP and PSM. That's the bubble in the upper left-hand corner. However, over time, people realized that it was really conducive towards improving plant safety by having regulations that were synchronized and having the different agencies all looking at the same thing. So eventually that morphed and simplified into the environment on the right-hand side, lower right, that we have right now, with a lot of overlapping regulations, but essentially the same elements. So what do we do about this? What should you be doing right now? Well, if you're a California covered facility, there are specific requirements you have to meet now. You should be aware of what's coming up by paying close attention to the PSM requirements for refineries as a best practice that are currently being proposed by Cal-OSHA and being rolled out. If you're in Contra Costa County or the city of Richmond, there are 9 specific sites that are called out that are required to implement their industrial safety ordinance. That's on the books, that's required now, with deadlines in the future, of course, but there are requirements to start implementing at this time. If you're a petroleum refinery in California, obviously you've got to adhere to whatever requirements exist for your jurisdiction, but there's a lot of other things that are coming up with respect to the proposed changes to PSM from Cal-OSHA. I hope I'm getting all this stuff right. Okay, one of the recommendations from a key regulator is really to start moving ahead. Even if the regulations aren't finalized, even if there's a lot of guidance, there's really not much guidance documents out there. The fact is, moving forward can help simplify your efforts later, because there's likely to be a resource pinch when all these things get on the books and everybody is required to start implementing them. If you're making progress, you're likely to get you're likely to get a little bit of a break, or get some credit for work that you've already done. So everybody's encouraging people to move forward, especially for some elements like the hierarchy of hazard control analysis or the HCA requirement that Jordan mentioned, that are much more cost effective if you implement them early in the design phase or as soon as possible before you lose options or the options become more expensive. If you're throughout the United States, if you're a PSM or RMP covered petroleum processing facility, what's happening in California with Cal-OSHA's PSM upgrades is likely to be looked at as a best practice in terms of what people should do to protect their employees, and also these things also protect the community. You should be aware of that, and as appropriate, have a plan to either implement what makes sense or how you would address how you can justify not doing it. Everybody should be closely monitoring all these regulatory changes. Sooner or later, these are going to percolate throughout the United States and going to be applied to a number of different facilities, non-petroleum refineries, other highly hazardous facilities, or facilities that the agencies consider to be highly hazardous, even if you don't consider your process to be all that dangerous. Please consider these new practices that are being rolled out as something that people may point to, both from a professional perspective or a legal liability perspective, as a best practice, and also recognize that there are specific general duty requirements that want you to apply best practices So again, the key thing is awareness. A lot's changing. You should be aware of what's going on. These evolving guidelines, there are guidance documents out there. A lot of these things like damage mechanism reviews are very similar to a lot of the mechanical integrity program elements that you're currently applying. The safeguard protection analysis, layer of protection analysis, it's not a brand new technique. A lot of people use this, especially for new designs. So a lot of these things can be readily implemented as part of your current program. It may look really scary. The elements may have different names, but there's a lot of ways to absorb those into your current program. That's been kind of the theme of some of our webinars in terms of if you're doing these things already, how do you package it? How do you implement it in terms of your current practices to make it as digestible as possible? There's also some, as I mentioned, there's a URL in that yellow band from a few slides ago that provides some resources. Mike Knorr, Jordan Schultz, myself, we're putting together some papers for the Global Congress on Process Safety that encapsulate those drafts that may be downloaded also from that resource site that we've put together. And actually, I was invited to do a third presentation on implementation of HAZOP and LOPA during the design phase. It's not on this list. That just happened a week or so ago, and we'll be doing a third presentation at the GCPS. So anyhow, in summary, this is changing dramatically. There's a lot of agencies taking a fresh look at these safety management system programs, even though the current focus is on California and refineries specifically in California. There's a potential for expansion to a lot of other facilities, depending on how your agency views these things, whether they consider them best practice or not. It's likely to be very chaotic. It's a moving target. There's going to be a lot of desynchronization in the near term with a lot of overlap, so it's going to require a lot of care in terms of implementation. I do see a potential long-term movement towards synchronization. There are practical things to do right now that you can move your program forward and encapsulate a lot of these elements. So again, you should, all these risk, if you're involved in the risk management business, you should carefully monitor these modernization programs, keep sights of your long-term objectives at your facility, and put together a strategy for doing this. The last thing you want to do is bury your head in the sand on this. It is important. There's a lot happening, and you shouldn't look at that as, oh, this just applies to them and not me. A lot of these things are going to be rolled out for a lot of different facilities and also geographically. So what I'd like to do is open it up for questions, and while you're thinking of your questions, I'll go ahead and remind you that we do a continuing webinar series on this. If you're not currently on our distribution list, you probably want to do that so that you can tune in to a lot of the best practices from a technical perspective or changes in the regulatory environment, and we'll try to help as much as possible. So with no further ado, and I hope you enjoyed the fact this was a short webinar today because we're trying to compress it and keep the time to what we were trying to do at the Global Congress on Process Safety in a couple of weeks. And I'll invite Jordan up and we'll answer questions.
Thank you, Steve. I have a couple questions here. Based on the OSHA RFI, EPA RFI, and Cal OSHA draft PSM regulation, it seems as if the agencies are moving in different directions. Where do you see this going, and is this functional?
You want to take his first stab?
I'll take a first stab at it. So currently in the near term and kind of even the medium term, there is a little bit of deviation, but I know it's been expressed that the interest between the executive order and some other conversations is towards synchronization. So I would be curious to see once how it kind of boils down, but what's your opinion?
Yeah, you're gonna see a lot of different requirements in the near term and medium term. In the long term, this will get sorted out. You just want to have a very good basis for what you're doing. If you're not doing certain elements, or if you feel certain things don't apply to you from a regulatory coverage perspective, make sure it's clearly documented. There is going to be a lot of confusion, a lot of different agencies. A lot of the agency representatives, obviously, because we're getting different drafts that have different requirements, don't necessarily see eye to eye with respect to what's important or what's necessary. So you'll want to make sure you carefully monitor this thing, adhere to specific requirements, and if there's something that's questionable, and we encounter this all the time with our clients, make sure you clearly document why you're doing or not doing certain things, especially the not doing part. Alex? Oh, Jordan, anything else?
Oh, that's it.
Okay.
Thank you, Steve. Next question is, I've heard the term SPA. What is it, and why do I want to do it?
Want to go and start?
Why don't you start this one off?
All right. SPA is Safeguard Protection Analysis. It's one of the elements that Jordan had on his chart. Primarily, it's focused on justifying the effectiveness of the safeguards that you're applying when you're doing your process hazard analysis. The most common technique for doing this is a layer protection analysis. The LOPA is a way to quantify, get a different perspective on the scenario and the effectiveness of the safeguards that you're applying to it. We did have in one of our earlier webinars, I believe it was June, we did have a specific discussion on tips associated with effective application of SPA, and I just encourage you to go back and take a look at that. There's a number of things you can do as part of your current PHA assessments that really don't require a lot of extra effort, justify your safeguards, and address the spirit and specific requirements of, or the spirit of SPA. Now, the specific requirements, if you're doing LOPA, usually requires, if you're doing it like we do, which is synchronized with the HAZOP, an extra 10 or 20% effort. But again, you get a lot of extra perspective and value associated with that.
Yeah, like Steve said, I pretty much hit the nail on the head. One of the major things is basically the SPA. You're aiming to make sure that you don't just have a bunch of safeguards, but that they are as effective as they need to be to make sure your risk is tolerable.
All right. Thank you, Steve and Jordan. Next question is, where do we find a summary of the January 1st CalARP changes?
Okay, good. Yeah, those will be located on that URL in the yellow band on the slide with the 7 overlapping circles that identified some of the key agencies that are involved in these modernization programs. At the bottom of that, you'll see a link to our website, and on that, in that link is a resource page that includes an opportunity to download these January 1st requirements. It's a fairly minor update, but there's a lot of the other proposed regulations that have a much more significant impact. Again, all that can be found on our website, www.rmpcorp.com.
Okay, I believe that's all the questions that we have.
All right, great. All right, well, let me thank everybody for attending. Appreciate your interest. And again, I just encourage everybody to carefully monitor these things, pay attention to what's going on, and make sure that you're addressing the things you need to do at your facility. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to you for the next webinar.